You asked for it, so we are going to deliver. Today, we are going to talk about the best index funds for you to buy this year. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to break this out by type of index fund. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about the best total market index funds. So in order to do this, we're going to do fund breakdowns for each of my favorite index funds. So the first one we are going to be doing is VTSAX. And if you've never heard of VTSAX, it is one of my favorite Vanguard index funds. And with these total stock market index funds, their goal is to mirror the entire stock market, meaning you are owning thousands of different companies all inside of one index fund. Now, when you look at VTSAX, we're going to look at the holdings here. As you look through VTSAX, you can see that the category is a large blend category. And what we're looking for here is we want to know what is the turnover ratio. So if you look at the turnover ratio there at VTSAX, it is at 3%. That is a very low turnover ratio. And the turnover ratio is going to dictate how much you're going to pay in taxes inside of these funds. So you want that to be as low as possible because that means they are buying and selling a minimum amount of stocks. Secondly, here, we are going to be looking at the expense ratio. And the expense ratio is incredibly low as well at 0.04%. Now let's jump down to the rate of return. So as we look at these returns here, we're looking at VTSAX's return since inception. It has returned 7.41% to investors. And over the course of the last 10 years, 11.4%, 5 years, 9.98%, 3 years, 12%, and year to date, 8.74% at the time recording this. What you want to look at is the long-term returns more so than you want to look at year to year. Now, the top 10 holdings here are all companies that we have heard of before. We have Apple, we have Microsoft, Amazon, Nvidia, Alphabet, which is Google, Meta, Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's company, Tesla, and United Healthcare Group. So these are all amazing companies that you want to hold. But if you're investing at somewhere like Fidelity, maybe you want the Fidelity option instead so you don't have to pay those extra fees. And Fidelity has one called FSKAX, which is number 2. And at FSKAX, we are looking here at the turnover ratio is extremely low. It's even lower than VTSAX at 2%. And the expense ratio is also lower at 0.01%. So FSKAX also has a dividend yield of 1.53% if you are interested in the dividend yield. Now, the rate of return for FSKAX over the course of its lifetime is a little lower than VTSAX. Only it's been around since 2011 when there's a lot of recovery going on. But over the course of its lifetime, it's been 8%. And over the last 10 years, 11.36%. Over the last 5 years, 9.95%. Over the last 3 years, 12.11%. And over the last year, 1.94%. Now, the top 10 holdings here of FSKAX is Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Nvidia, Google, Berkshire Hathaway, Google, Meta, ExxonMobil, and United Healthcare Group. So the weights are a little bit different than VTSAX. So you got to look at those and say, hey, is this differential matter to me and how much do I actually care about that? Now, number 3 is going to be Fidelity's zero fee fund, which is FZROX. And I also hold FZROX and VTSAX. And FZROX has a 0% expense ratio, which is the amazing thing about this fund. Now, it has a low turnover ratio at 3%. Its total holdings are 2709, and it's got a dividend yield of 1.54%. Now, the rate of return since its inception, it's not been around for very long, so it's only been around for a couple of years, but the lifetime inception is 9.48%. Over the last 3 years, 12.35%, and over the last 1 year, 2.13%. And here's its top 10 holdings. Same thing as all these other ones. They should be very close to each other. Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Nvidia, Alphabet, Berkshire Hathaway, ExxonMobil, and United Healthcare Group. So another great fund, FZROX, because of that 0% expense ratio, you are paying zero amount in fees, so it's a great fund to be holding. Next one is the Schwab one. If you are a Schwab investor, this is a great one to look at. SWTX, which is their total stock market index fund. And inside of the Schwab fund, they have a very low turnover ratio at 2%. The expense ratio is 0.03%, and they have a 1.49% yield. And as you look at this fund has been around for a long period of time. You can see that it has some great returns as we look at the total returns here over the course of the last couple of years. This goes year by year because Schwab likes to break them down year over year, and you can see, where those returns actually land as we look at these. So year to date, 15.16%, which matters a lot less, but we want to look over over the long term to see how they hold up. And the top 10 holdings should be the same as everybody else because we're all trying to track the same index here. So that's the name of the game when you buy some of these. Really, I would not gripe over which ones you are holding. What I would worry about is, are there fees associated with the brokerage account that you are holding? Because if there are fees associated with that brokerage account, that you just want to buy the equivalent at that place. So if you're at Schwab, I wouldn't buy Vanguard funds if Schwab's going to charge a fee. Instead, I would just buy the Schwab fee because we're trying to get the same returns here and just compare the returns, make sure they are very close to comparable. And if they are, then you can make that decision in a much more wise decision. But like we said, top 10 holdings here: Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Nvidia, Alphabet, Facebook, Berkshire Hathaway, Tesla, United Healthcare Group. Now, section 2, we're going to be diving into the best S&P 500 index funds. If you don't know what the S&P 500 is, the S&P 500 is the 500 largest U.S. stocks in the stock market. These are the Goliaths, the big blue chip companies, big technology companies, those types of things. And this is what Warren Buffett holds the majority of his family's portfolio in, as an S&P 500 index fund. So we're going to start off with the first one, which is Vanguard's 500 index fund, or VFIAX. I love Vanguard funds. They are amazing. And at VFIAX, you're going to see a yield of 1.56%. And you're also going to see a very low turnover ratio at 2%, and the expense ratio very low, 0.04%. Now, these funds have been around for a very long period of time. So 7.16% since inception is the rate of return. And over the last 10 years, it's been 11.95%, 5 years, 10.98%, 3 years, 12.88%, and year to date is 9.63%. But I would look at the longer time frames, like everything else, more so than I would some of these other things. Now, the top 10 holdings are going to be very similar to the total stock market. The reason for that is these companies are some of the largest companies in the US. They're going to be weighted the most heavily, so you're going to have overlap if you own both those funds. There's nothing wrong with overlap, but sometimes you don't want to be redundant inside of your portfolio. So if you hold both, there's nothing wrong with that. Just make sure you understand the overlap here. So top 10 holdings are Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Nvidia, Alphabet, Facebook, Berkshire Hathaway, Tesla, United Healthcare Group. Now, if you're a Fidelity investor, here's one of the better S&P 500 index funds at Fidelity is FXAIX. And in some of my specific Fidelity portfolios, I hold this index fund specifically. So 1.60% is the yield, and we have a total holdings of 506 companies. The turnover ratio is 3%, and the expense ratio, again, is lower than Vanguard's, 0.01%. So if you look at the total returns over the last couple of months, we have a couple of them here, but those are irrelevant in comparison to the long-term returns. And if you look at the top 10 holdings here, we have Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Nvidia, Tesla, Berkshire Hathaway, Alphabet, Exxon, and United Healthcare Group. Very similar to the last one. Now, the Schwab S&P 500 index fund is SWPPX. And inside of SWPPX, we're going to be holding 505 different companies with a 2% turnover ratio and a 0.02% expense ratio. So what you can see here is Fidelity and Schwab are trying to compete with Vanguard by lowering their expense ratio a little more, and that's how they're trying to compete, because Vanguard has such incredible funds, and they hold, and the majority of long-term index investors know that, so they've been there for a long time. So if you look at that, that's why their fees are a little lower, and you can look at returns over the last 15 years, 10.33%, over the last 10 years, 12.56%. This is very similar to Vanguard's. 11.57% the last 5 years, 3 years, 13.93%, and 1 year's 22.29%. Top 10 holdings are going to be exactly the same. You just want to look at the weight here, but Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Nvidia, Alphabet, Meta, Berkshire, Tesla, and United Healthcare Group. So very, very similar. May not be exactly the same, but very, very similar. Now, if you want to have a 3-fund portfolio, one thing you may want to do is have some international stock exposure. So if you want that international stock exposure, I got the best funds for my favorite brokerages, Vanguard, Fidelity, Schwab here. And the first one is going to be VTIAX at Vanguard. This is Vanguard's total international stock Admiral shares. And inside of these shares, we've got a yield of 2.95%. So a higher dividend yield on these shares. And in addition, we're going to have some of these total holdings at 7,983 stocks. So there's a lot of holdings in there. The turnover ratio is going to be higher when you have more holdings at 5%, still extremely low, but the expense ratio is higher at 0.11%. And you can see the rate of returns here on Vanguard. They have not been great on any international fund across the board, but since inception, 4.28%, 10-year 4.2, 5-year 2.37, and 3-year 4.47. I don't hold many international funds at all. The reason for this is because of these rate of returns. These rate of returns have been so low. A lot of people argue with me on that you still need that international exposure because you're going to need it in the future. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what's going to happen, but all I have is those historic returns. And so if you want international exposure, I have nothing wrong with that. More power to you. I think it's actually wise to have some international exposure. Now, the top 10 holdings here, very different than the S&P 500 and the total stock market holdings. So these are going to be other companies that you may or may not have heard of. So you got Taiwan Semiconductor, Nestle, ASML Holdings, Samsung, Novo Nordisk. We have a ton of other companies here, Shell, and some others that you may have heard of as you go through this. Now, if you're a Fidelity investor, here is the best Fidelity fund, which is FTIHX. And FTIHX is one with a 2.39% yield, and it holds 5,884 different companies, and it has a lower turnover ratio at 3%, and the expense ratio is also lower at 0.06%. So as we look at this Fidelity fund here, it is still underperforming the S&P 500 and other categories. It is at 4.54% over the last 5 years, 9.3%, which is decently high over the last 3 years, and 17.1% over the last 1 year. And we have the same top 10 holdings: Taiwan Semiconductor, Nestle, Tencent Holdings, Novo Nordisk, LVMH, which is Louis Vuitton, which is actually a very large company now. They are a huge conglomerate now. I think their CEO, the founder, is possibly the richest man in the world at this point in time, so they are doing very well. And then you have Shell and a couple of other companies in there. Now, Schwab's is SWISX, and at Schwab, we have a high yield at 2.55%. The total holdings are much lower, though, which is very interesting. So if you want that really big diversification of international funds, then maybe you go with the Vanguard one. But if you don't want that big diversification, you want less holdings, and you want to try to get your returns up, which this has not got its returns up, but if you want to get your returns up, this may be an option. So the turnover ratio is 5%. The expense ratio is 0.06%. And you can look at these bleak returns we've got here over the course of 15 years, 3.17%, 10 years, 5.32%, 5 years, 4.41%, and 3 years, 9.2%. So in most cases, long-term, you can get more in something like a high-yield savings account right now than you could those long-term returns. Top 10 holdings are going to be the same: Nestle, ASML Holdings, Novo Nordisk, LVMH, Shell, AstraZeneca, BHP, and some others. Now, maybe you're looking for some other funds out there. Maybe you want some bond exposure. Well, Vanguard has the Balance Index Fund Admiral Shares, or VBIAX, if you want bond exposure to ride out some of that volatility. And in VBIAX, really high turnover ratio, 19%. The expense ratio is a little higher at 0.07%, and the returns are a little better than the international funds. Since inception, you can see the returns for VBIAX 6.28%, over the last 10 years, 7.52%. Those returns are rising because of inflation rates, and a lot of other things are happening where bond rates are increasing over that time frame. The next one we have, if you want some mid-cap exposure, is the Vanguard Mid-Cap Index Fund, so VIMAX. And inside of VIMAX, there are mid-cap holdings, and a lot of people think it's wise to hold some mid-cap. They have 341 different holdings here. The turnover ratio is going to be higher on mid-cap because there's a lot more turnover happening there, so it's at a 12% turnover ratio. Still fine. It's completely fine to have a 12% turnover ratio, and the expense ratio is 0.05% with this one. The yield is also 1.69%, but you can see since inception had some great returns here: 9.38% since inception on the 10-year, 9.41%, 5 years, 7.05%, 3-year, 9.68%. And the top 10 holdings are going to be very different from all the others because these are mid-cap companies. These are smaller companies. So Motorola, Dexcom, Arthur J. Gallagher, Microchip Technology, Realty Income Group, which is a very large REIT. And all these companies here are going to be valued very differently than they would be in another way. Now, maybe you want some Russell 2000 exposure. So this is a Russell 2000 value fund from Vanguard, VSIAX, and VSIAX actually tracks the Russell 2000, which are 2,000 small cap companies. Smaller companies are what these are going to be, and these are small cap value companies. I think the Russell 2000 is very interesting, and a lot of times when the S&P 500 is struggling, this usually helps bring it up and helps perform. So the yield on this is 2.4%. It has 851 total holdings. The turnover ratio is 13%, and it has a 0.07% expense ratio on this one. Now, let's look at the returns over time. So since inception, 10.90%. Great returns over the last 10 years, 8.16%. Over the last 5 years, 4.4%. And over the last 3 years, 15.31%. These companies took a hit during COVID. They did not do as well because obviously logistically, it's a little bit of a nightmare when you're that size of a company to try to figure all this stuff out. Now, the top 10 holdings on this one, this is the last one we're doing, is Builders First Source, Atmos Energy, IDEX Corp, Reliance Steel, Booz Allen Hamilton, First Citizen Bank Shares, Kimco Realty, which is a big REIT, and Gaming and Leisure Properties, and some other ones in there. So these are another great fund if you want some small cap holdings. I hope you guys learned a ton about different index funds that are out there. These are some of my favorites for 2023. If you guys have any questions, leave them down in the comments below, and I left any out, let me know it. If you want me to do one on ETFs for my favorite ETFs for the entire year, let me know that one as well, and we will make that video for you. Hope you guys learned a ton. Don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and we will see you on the next video.